Welcome back. We now have enemies and combat, and our game is functional. But we'd like multiple types of enemies. We don't just want one kind of enemy in our game, but we've gone through all this work just to create our paladin, right? And this involves a lot of code. And we'd like to use all of that code for all of our enemies. We don't want to have to duplicate or recreate any of our hard work. Now, this includes our animation blueprints. You see, our enemy uses a paladin animation blueprint. If we go to enemy and paladin, we see we have ABP paladin. And this blueprint handles updating the variables for the poses for the paladin character. We see in blueprint thread safe update animation, we're updating variables here. And our anim graph has our main states with idle, walk, run, and dead, so we're checking some variables here. Now, if we want to create another type of enemy, we could just go and create an animation blueprint for that enemy and recreate all the logic here and recreate all the logic in blueprint thread safe update animation, but that's not the best way to do it. If all of our enemies have the same basic behavior, we should be able to have one animation blueprint that has the basic functionality, and we could just swap in those specific animations, for example, our dead poses and what have you. We can achieve this with animation blueprint templates. An animation blueprint template is going to have all the basic states and transitions and variables, but we can instance it for individual types of enemies with different skeletons and skeletal meshes. So we're going to do that and then reuse our animation blueprint template for multiple types of enemies. That way our world can be populated with all kinds of creatures. They don't even all have to be humanoid, as we'll soon see. So we're going to create a base enemy animation blueprint template, and we'll go ahead and place this right here in the enemy folder, right next to our base enemy. So let's right-click here in the enemy folder, go to animation, and select animation blueprint. Now, you can't see it because it's off the screen, but there's an option to select template. It's off the screen because my display resolution is larger to show you what I'm doing easier. But I'm temporarily going to change my display settings so you can see what I'm talking about. I'm going to set it back to 100%. So now things are going to look smaller, and I can right-click and go to animation, select animation blueprint, and now I see the full menu. And when we make a new animation blueprint, we usually have to select a skeleton, right? Well, instead we can choose template. And now we're creating an animation blueprint not specific to any particular skeleton. So we can click create. And I'm going to call this ABP underscore enemy. So this is our generic enemy animation blueprint. And we can fill this out with all the logic we need. Now I'm going to go ahead and change my display settings again. Now things are bigger and easier for you to see. Now let's open ABP enemy. Just like all animation blueprints, it has its own anim graph and it has an event graph. And we can also override blueprint thread safe update animation by going to functions, clicking the dropdown, and selecting blueprint thread safe update animation. So we can use this to update our variables just like we're doing in Paladin. Now we need some variables, and Paladin has the variables that we need. We have an enemy based on BP base enemy. We're going to create an enemy variable in ABP enemy. So let's go to variables, click plus, and we'll call this enemy. And we'll change its type to BP underscore base enemy. And that'll be an object reference. Now, Paladin also has a death pose, which is an eDeath pose enum. We're going to add that as well. So let's add another variable called death pose, and we'll change its type to eDeath pose. Let's see what else we have. Paladin also has a ground speed, and that's a float. Let's add that to ABP enemy. So ground speed, and we'll change its type to float. Next, ABP Paladin has enemy state of type E enemy state. Let's go back to ABP enemy and add an enemy state variable. And this will be of type E enemy state. So now we have the basic variables. And ABP Paladin is getting some values from the enemy. Now, it can do that because in the event graph, we set up the enemy right here. We use try get pawn owner, cast to BP enemy, and set the enemy. We do this in Blueprint initialize animation. And then we get the character movement component, and we set that to a variable as well. So we're going to do that here in ABP enemy by going over to the event graph, by overriding Blueprint initialize animation. And now we can get it by right-clicking and searching for it, or selecting the drop-down that says override and choosing Blueprint initialize animation. Now, right here, there's already a try get pawn owner node. I'm going to drag it down and use it. And the result of this function call is going to be cast to BP base enemy. So all of our enemies will be based on this blueprint, and we'll make sure of that. And the return result can be used to set our enemy variable. I'm going to hold Alt and left-click and drag it in to get a setter. And we'll set the value of this from the cast. Now this only happens once, so we're not doing this every frame or anything like that. So we only do the cast one time. And from the enemy, we're going to call get character movement. And all the way down at the bottom is the character movement getter. And we're going to right-click on this and promote it to a variable. And I'm just going to let it be called character movement, so I won't change its name. And now we have these variables set at the very beginning. Now we need to update these other variables, and we're going to do that in Blueprint ThreadSafe update animation, just like we're doing in Paladin. And we can take a look here. We're setting death pose, we're setting ground speed, and we're setting the enemy state. So let's go ahead and set those in our generic ABP enemy animation blueprint template. So the first thing we're going to set is our enemy state. So I'm going to hold Alt and click and drag it out to get a setter. Now we need a property access node. So we're going to right click, type property access, and get it. And we want to get the enemy state from our enemy. So we'll click the drop down and hover over enemy and search for enemy state. And we'll select that. So now we have enemy.enemy state. That's going to be used to set our enemy state. Now be careful when you open this drop down. Don't select enemy state right here. This is our variable on this animation blueprint. So we'd basically be setting it to itself. We need the enemy state from our enemy variable. Very important. Now after setting enemy state, we can set our ground speed. So I'm going to hold Alt and click and drag out a setter for ground speed. And we'll get this from our character movement variable. And we'll do this through a property access node. So we're going to get property access, click the drop down, and hover over character movement and search for velocity. And we'll get the velocity. So we want the velocity that doesn't have the arrow here. So we'll click that, and from velocity, we want vector length xy. So we'll get vector length xy and use that to set ground speed. And our last variable to update is death pose. So I can Alt click and drag to get a setter for this, and we want the death pose from our enemy. So once again, we'll get another property access node and expand the dropdown, go to enemy and search for death pose. And we'll go ahead and get that enum value and hook it in. And now we're setting these variables. So that takes care of the variables. Now let's hop over to the anim graph. We want our main states here, and we can go back to see Paladin. Here in Paladin's anim graph, we can go out to the outermost level, and we see that we have a state machine going into a slot. Remember, the slot is there because our animation montages use the default slot. So the pose has to run through the default slot for us to see those montages playing. So we're going to make a main states state machine and run it through the default slot here in ABP enemy. So we can right click, type state machine, and add new state machine. And I'm going to click on its name and call it main states. And we'll drag off of its output pose and type slot, and we'll use slot default slot and hook that into the output pose. Now we just need to flesh out main states. So let's go into main states, and we're going to look at the main states for Paladin. So here in Paladin, we'll go into main states, and we see that we have an idle walk run and a dead state. So we'll add those here in our main states for ABP enemy. So we'll drag off, add state, and I'll call this idle walk run. And from this, we'll drag up and add a state called dead. Now we have our states. Now our transition rule needs something inside of it. So we're going to go into that. And in ABP Paladin, what we're checking here in this transition rule is enemy state. We're seeing if it's equal to dead. We'll check that here as well in ABP enemy. So we'll get enemy state. We'll use equal enum and see if it's equal to the dead state, and we'll hook that up. Now our transition rule is defined. Now we need something in these states. Usually we put animations in here and blend spaces, but we can't put specific animations in these states or blend spaces. These have to be generic, so we can use this for any character. Well, let's go into the dead state and remind ourselves what we did in ABP Paladin in the dead state. So we'll go into the dead state here, and we're blending poses on the death pose enum. And we have a number of sequence players here for each of the dead poses, right? Paladin dead 1 through 6. These are those static poses with the paladin just laying on the back or on the stomach. Now, we want some sequence players in ABP enemy, but we don't want specific animation.